And now on the line is Lynn Boylan. Lynn, as all or most of you know, is the Sinn Féin MEP for Dublin. Lynn, welcome back to Near FM.
Thanks for having me back on, Darren.
Okay, Lynn, we are recording this interview on Sunday the 22nd of June, although it might not be broadcast on Tony's programme on Near FM for another week. On Thursday, just gone the 19th, there was great news coming from the European Parliament in relation to animal welfare. Can you tell our listeners today, Lynn, for those who don't know, about what this great news is?
Yeah, so it's a really progressive report or position that's been taken by the European Parliament around traceability of cats and dogs, around the online advertising and also the breeding standards or rules that should be applied to breeders across the board. So just to explain for your listeners, Darren, that, I mean, EU legislation is very complicated and takes a long time to come through. But in December 2023, the EU Commission brought forward their proposal to address some of these issues. And what happened on Thursday was the European Parliament have now put forward their position ahead of negotiations, and thankfully the Parliament's position is far more progressive than the European Commission's, and is trying to close all the loopholes around backyard breeding and the illegal transport of cats and dogs, and also dealing with the online advertising and trying to make sure that people can verify where animals are coming from when they're put up for sale online. So it's a really, really good day, and hopefully when we go into the negotiations in the next coming months, the European Parliament's position is the position that will be the final law.
Okay, yeah, I read a couple of press releases about the story in the last couple of days. What strikes me the most, Lynn, about these measures, if they come into law, is that they will, I think, have a huge or massive impact in relation to puppy farms. I'm thinking of traceability. Am I right in thinking that, Lynn?
Yeah, absolutely. It has minimum standards for breeders for the amount of litters that a female dog can have, also around proper feeding, proper veterinary care, and it will apply to all breeders because, you know, anyone who's interested in this will know Ireland has the reputation of being the puppy farm capital of Europe, but a lot of the breeding is going on in backyard breeders, or sort of like you'll have somebody breeding animals and, you know, I suppose reporting a certain amount of the breeding, and then some of the breeding is actually happening off books and out of sight. So this is going to make a huge difference around the traceability of all of those pups, and hopefully to put an end to some of the illegal puppy farming, because I think most people when they want to get a pet, I'll always say go for a rescue rather than buying off a breeder. But if you are going to buy a dog to bring into your family, I think most people genuinely think that they're buying it from, you know, a small breeder who really cares about animals. But these individuals are very, very good at creating an image of, you know, this dog reared in the home. You know, you can meet both its parents, when in actual fact the reality is much, much worse. They're sheds, they're animals that very rarely see any human contact. So hopefully this legislation is going to try and bring an end to that awful practice.
Okay, just for clarification, like, am I right in saying like a lot of breeders are like that, but like some of them are probably okay? Would be that the case?
Yeah, I mean, there are people out there who are breeding dogs and, you know, genuinely love dogs, and especially when it comes to, you know, people who want a specific breed, you know, and the Kennel Club would stand over a lot of the breeders that they would have on their books. I suppose where the issues are concerned is more the very large-scale breeders, but also the so-called designer pups now, where you're having dogs breeding that would never actually be able to breed in the real world. So you're using artificial insemination and practices like that to cross dogs that shouldn't actually be able to cross, and producing breeds like Pomskis and things like that. So there's a lot of concern around the welfare of those animals. What has also brought out with this legislation, but thankfully the Irish government and the previous government banned some of the practices already around ear cropping, around e-collars, but that will now apply across the EU, so that's also a welcome measure.
Okay. I was talking to John O'Callaghan from Dog Advocacy Ireland yesterday, Lynn, and I was telling him that I'm interviewing you today. He asked me to ask you in our interview about the whole area of enforcement of the law in relation to puppy farms. He was saying that in Ireland we already have some legislation on puppy farms, but often the law is tragically not getting implemented. What would you say on that point, Lynn, about enforcement of animal welfare law on puppy farms now and even in the future if this EU laws come in?
Yeah. No, and he's 100% correct, and this is the problem, is that different local authorities take different approaches to, because it's each local authority issues the licence to the dog breeding establishments, and then they decide how often they go and inspect, whether they notify in advance of inspections. So there is a huge disparity from one local authority to another. And of course that then allows dog breeders to pick and choose where they're going to develop their puppy farm, because they'll pick the local authority that does the less inspections and has a very light touch approach to it. What we'd like to see is consistency across the board. So bringing an independent veterinary inspection system, so taking it away from the local authorities, because there is a conflict of interest if you're receiving the licence fee for regulating these dog breeding establishments, and then you're also the same authority that's then monitoring them and deciding whether to renew licences or not. So it should be an independent veterinary inspection system. And also then there needs to be, and it is improving, but it's still not good enough in terms of access to the dog breeding establishment information and the number of dogs that are kept, so the number of dogs that there are licensed to be kept on site. I remember doing a practice before of going on each local authority and looking up their dog breeding establishments. Some listed it very clearly and would say, there's the number of dog breeding establishments, this is the number of breeding bitches that are on site. You'd go to another local authority and there's nowhere at all on their website giving you that information, and you have to go and request it. So it makes it easier for someone who is going to be buying a dog to double check whether the dog that they're getting is coming from one of these dog breeding establishments and just how many dogs are on site. Because if you can imagine, if there's a dog breeding establishment with 300 breeding bitches and it's perfectly legal, it's licensed by the local authority, that means that there could be thousands of dogs on site at any one point in time. And, that's just not good from an animal welfare perspective to have that many dogs on site in terms of socialisation, the ratio of staff to dogs as well. So that's an area where we definitely need to improve the conditions, but also need to be very transparent for the public about the size of the breeding establishment that they're going to purchase a dog from.
One of the biggest themes in the last general election, I heard from animal welfare activists, animal lovers, is that there should be in Ireland some kind of a national animal welfare authority to cover everything to do with animal policies. Are you and Sinn Féin in favour of that as well? I'm thinking in terms of the current government as well, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I certainly, when I was on the Agriculture Committee, we did and it was me who initiated the report. We did a lot of work around dog welfare in Ireland, and one of the key recommendations that came out was not so much having an independent unit, but that all of the dog welfare would at least come under one department, so that there was one single minister responsible. Because what you have at the moment is you have the Department of Agriculture, you have the Department of Local Government, and then you also have the Department of Rural Affairs. So that it's spread across three departments. That means things fall through the gaps and the enforcement isn't what it should be. So that recommendation should happen, that everything comes under the one department. But at the end of the day, we need proper enforcement. So having a unit, and as I said, I'm not opposed to it, but if you have a unit established, you still need to resource that and have the personnel to be able to go out and to police it. We know around the control of dogs issues, stray dogs, dogs being abandoned, licensing, dog fouling. There's just not enough dog wardens at all to cover the amount of dogs that are in the country. I mean, I remember looking before and seeing that it was about, in some parts of the country, like one dog warden to thousands of licensed dogs. And then that's not counting the dogs that aren't licensed that are out there. So we need to invest in the personnel and look at other countries that are doing this really well. I mean, Sweden and Italy have very strict rules around keeping dogs and making sure that what laws they have are enforced. So that's where I'd love the priority to be. Is to put in the resources and also to put in the personnel, and then have a zero tolerance when it comes to enforcing the law.
Okay, this new planned law is for, the EU is for dogs and cats, so other areas of animal welfare will be dealt with in other legislation, will they, Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, one of the welcome things about this is that we've already got it's mandatory for dogs to be microchipped in Ireland. It's now going to be the case that will apply to cats as well. So that's a welcome improvement. But what the European Parliament voted for, because there was huge pushback against this, is what's called a positive list for other companion animals. So currently in Ireland and lots of European countries, there are very exotic species of animals being brought in and sold, and people getting them and not knowing how to look after them, and they have very specific care requirements. Sometimes it's very costly. So what the Parliament has proposed is that the EU will consider bringing in what's called a positive list, which means that only the animals that are on that list can be imported or sold as companion animals, and anything that's not on the list then cannot be. So that would be a really good progressive move to sort of reduce what we see, like, we see terrapins being dumped into rivers, we see, snakes getting out of cages and escaping into the wild, and people just getting animals that they think look cute, they've seen them on TikTok, and then they get them home and they don't realise that they need, very, very specific requirements around heat, around the type of food that they get, around the housing conditions. So the positive list, if that is taken on board in the final piece of legislation, would be another really good step for animal welfare that doesn't include dogs and cats.
Okay, I'm not aware of any other current Irish MEPs apart from yourself, Lynn, being active in the broad area of animal welfare in the European Parliament. Is that a correct assessment?
Well, I think there's lots of people who say they're pro animal welfare, but there is a lot of work to be done around animal welfare. It's an area that I'm very passionate about, and when I was in the Seanad, as I said, I was a member of the Agricultural Committee and reminded them that they were not just responsible for agricultural animals, they were also the committee responsible for looking at cats and dogs and other companion animals. And I'll continue to keep that focus as an MEP. As I said, this was a really welcome step on Thursday. We still have a way to go now with the final negotiation over the next coming months. So I hope that whenever the final proposal comes forward, that the Irish MEPs will support the most ambitious version of that proposal. And that's where I suppose people have to put their money where their mouth is and support the legislation that gives the protection to the animals.
Okay, Lynn, it was great talking today on AirFM today, and thanks for being happy to take the time to talk to me, particularly with it being a Sunday. Before you go, I think you might just mention this, but can you tell me when we can expect this new legislation in the EU for dogs and cats to be law in Ireland and across the EU?
So what has to happen now is, now that the Parliament has its position, you get a negotiation process which is called a trilogue. So for listeners, that means that the European Council, which is represented by the member state governments, so the ministers, I imagine, for agriculture of each of the member states, they have their position. The Commission has its position, and then the Parliament has the position that we just voted for on Thursday. There'll be another negotiation, a three-way negotiation. Hopefully, they will take on board the Parliament because ours is the most ambitious. That could take a couple of months, so you're probably looking, given there's a summer break and that, it could be either autumn or winter of this year before the final text is agreed. And then there's usually a delay of a couple of years for member states to actually transpose that law into national law. So unfortunately, we still have a couple of years left, for this to become actual law. But there's nothing, absolutely nothing, stopping a government from going above and beyond and in doing this tomorrow if they wanted to. They don't have to wait for the EU to finally agree a position. They can go push ahead. And as I said, Ireland has some things that are already included in this, but there's also a lot more that they could be doing. So I would encourage people to keep the pressure on the Irish government to improve welfare, particularly for cats and dogs. But we know around the puppy farms that there's an awful lot more to be done in Ireland. So we don't need to wait 2 years.